Good morning, and welcome to everything you need to know about PHP 7.2. Hi, I'm Sebastian, and I've been doing things with PHP and to PHP for I don't know how many years now. I think it's 18 or 19 years since I had my first contact with PHP. What I do know that is that almost to the day, 17 years ago, I spoke for the first time at a PHP conference, which was in October 2000 in Cologne at the world's first PHP conference, which was quite nice, not necessarily because I got to speak at the conference, but because for the very first time I met people that I've only worked with prior to that via email and IRC and so on. So that was a really good boost for the community having these conference events going on. If I'm not at a conference, and not on a train, plane, or at home fixing bugs on PHP Unit or some other open source projects I'm involved in. Then I'm on site with customers helping teams build better software with PHP. That's what I do. Work as a consultant, the PHP consulting company, and that's all the advertising that you're going to get out of me. Not really into marketing and stuff. Don't care about that. So we are here today to talk about PHP 7, or I'm here to talk about PHP 7, PHP 7.2 in particular. And I have a confession to make. I don't know if you know this, but if you present at a conference like half a year before that, you have to submit your abstract, your proposal, and then it gets accepted. Which means like half a year ago, I needed to propose this session today, and half a year ago I knew that about 4 weeks later, we would get PHP 7.2. Half a year ago, there were a lot more RFCs under discussion, and it looked like they would be accepted. So I had no doubt that I would have enough to talk about today. Unfortunately, some of these RFCs have not been accepted yet, or not accepted in time. Some of them have been accepted since then and are now implemented for PHP 7.3. But that's something for next year. And others are still under discussion. So I have a little bit less that I expected to talk about, but I still hope that this will be useful and not boring. Boring is an important word that I'll come back to in a little bit. So, almost 2 years ago, PHP 7.0 was released. First major version for PHP since 2004. 2004, PHP 5 came out. We skipped PHP 6 because of book publishers. I will not go into details about that because that usually derails into Sebastian talking really bad about publishing companies, and I'm not in the mood to do that. If you're interested in details, find details on the internals mailing list or find me in the hallway track, and I may tell an anecdote or two about book publishers. So this happened 2 years ago. Can I get a quick show of hands from you guys who is not on PHP 7 yet? That is less than expected. So, okay. Just a quick recap for those who have not had the time to look at PHP 7 in detail yet and are not using PHP 7 yet. PHP 7 brought about a lot of change in 4 major areas. Performance, there was a lot of refactoring, there was a lot of cleanup, and changes to the type system. Performance is the thing that everybody cares about. Yay, it's 3 times faster, that's awesome. But you don't have to believe synthetic benchmarks that people like me publish. If you want to have proof that PHP 7 is faster, look at what companies are writing about it. That's something that I find really amazing about the PHP community. Almost every major site that uses PHP to develop their software has a tech blog or goes to conferences and speaks about their practical experience. And that's also the case for the upgrade from PHP 5 to PHP 7. Companies like Badoo have this blog post where they show, among many other stats, at this point in time, they made the switch from PHP 5 to PHP 6, to PHP 7, sorry. And their response time went down from 120, 130 milliseconds down to, what is this, like 50, 60 milliseconds, which is great. They were able to answer requests faster with PHP 7 than with PHP 5, while at the same time using less servers, which is why they estimate that they save around $1 million by switching from PHP 5 to PHP 7, which is nice. Rasmus likes to think about this in different terms. He's not talking about saving money. He talks about how good this is for the environment. It's green IT. If you can do the same or better with less servers, that means less hardware, less power, and that's good for the environment. So if you need yet another reason to go to PHP 7, think about the planet. Similar stats from Trivago. Don't get your hopes up too much. It doesn't go down to 0. Sorry, no 0 milliseconds response time. And also, don't think that they did something stupid and just went offline for an hour or two. What they did was they migrated the servers one by one. They took one server out of the load balancing. And this is a chart from the very first server that they took out. And they performed the upgrade, did some final testing on real production hardware before they put it back into the load balancer. And then for a couple of hours, they rotated, and it took them a couple of minutes to rotate the upgrade from PHP 5 to PHP 7. They are also very happy. Response time went down from something like 170, 180 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds, while using a lot less memory, from 40 megabytes per request to 10 megabytes per request. And they did that with a lot less CPU usage than before. They're quite happy. Similar charts from Tumblr and many other sites. And if you're interested in more benchmarks, Rasmus has a habit of collecting these benchmarks and making it his own benchmarks for standard open source solutions like Drupal, WordPress, Magento, whatever. The latest iteration of those benchmarks you can find in this presentation that he gave last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago in Brazil. If you're interested in more details about the new features of PHP 7.0 and PHP 7.1, there's a video recording of a presentation I gave 5 years ago on that in Bulgaria, if I remember correctly. Yes. Also, yesterday I talked for like 6 hours or so about PHP 7.0 and PHP 7.1. Sorry if you have missed that. If you're interested in details and learning more than you probably ever wanted to learn about type systems and what PHP actually does with regards to typing and why, there's also a video recording of that. And of course, if you don't want to watch videos, or if you don't want to watch me talking about stuff in a video, then you can read something that I wrote together with Arne and Stefan, which is this ebook. There's a 25% discount while IPC is going. So that might be a good chance to get that ebook. This ebook is special in the way that we continuously update the ebook. There are free updates for as long as PHP 7 is maintained and updated by the PHP project. There's an update coming soon in a couple of weeks that will cover all the changes of PHP 7.2. In the branch, we already have the first changes for PHP 7.3 for the RFCs that have already been accepted in PHP 7.3 and are already implemented there. We are not yet sure whether or not it makes sense to immediately put these things in the book. I'm rather hesitant to do that because way back when, before PHP 5 was released, I was writing a book on PHP 5 and all the changes in PHP 5, and in the 2 or 3 months before PHP 5 finally came out, I had to rewrite like half the book. So just because an RFC was accepted today or a couple of weeks ago and is implemented currently in master, does not guarantee that it will actually be released as PHP 7.3. In recent years, or for quite some time now actually, there has not been a last-minute pull-out of a feature, but you never know, and it would be really confusing to have something documented, and that's not going to happen. But we're continuously working on that, and that's it. So, in about 4 weeks' time, if all goes according to plan, PHP 7.2 will be released. So what do you need to know about PHP 7.2? Turns out you really have to know only very little. You only have to know, at least immediately and in the short term, about the things that have the potential of breaking things. Yes, it's a minor release, and there shouldn't be any backwards compatible breaks in there, but some tiny ones that shouldn't actually affect anyone crept in. But we'll go through those in a minute, and they are not, I don't think that they, well, in a perfect world, they wouldn't affect anyone. Well, in a much more perfect world, those mistakes would never have been in PHP, so now we did not have to fix them, but we don't live in a perfect world, so we have to deal with that. Remember, about 10 minutes ago, I said that the word boring would come up again. Please don't fall asleep. I mean boring in a very good way. PHP 7.2 is a boring release. And that's good. I like boring software. Boring software means that it's mature, that I can use it without fear of things going really wrong. Yes, there are some minor BC issues in there, but as you'll see, they shouldn't really have an effect. So, just in case somebody fell asleep, I'll wake you up with a hammer of breaking changes. Or at least I'll try to. Hopefully you find all of these things boring because you never ever wrote code like that. Or at least won't admit in public that you wrote code like that. So, getType has changed its result type for closed resources. That is a breaking change. It shouldn't affect anyone. It affected one test case in PHP unit for a really weird edge case where I had hard-coded the return value of getType in a test somewhere. That's been fixed. So what happens? Prior to PHP 7.2, if you call the getType function, which does exactly what the name suggests, you give it a variable and it returns the type of that variable. If you call that on a resource, and a resource is this special variable type thing that PHP has for network connections, file pointers, and so on. So for instance, if you call fopen, it returns a file pointer. It's something that you can use with other file system functions like fread, fput, and fwrite, and so on, to do something on the stream resource that represents that file on disk. If you call getType on a resource, like the one returned by fopen, you get resource with PHP 7.1. That has not changed in 7.2. What has changed is when you close that resource, when you, for instance, close that file using fclose, prior to PHP 7.2, for whatever reason, getType would return unknown type. Now it returns resource closed, which is much nicer, which is what it should have been since PHP 3 or PHP 4, whenever getType was introduced, but it didn't. just the other day, I looked at PHP source code for getType, and there is this huge switch statement where in one default case it says unknown type. That code is still in there, but I was not able to figure out for which type of variable that we still have in PHP. Somewhere it would now still return unknown type. I don't know. Need to ask it at some point. Someone who may or may not know. Could be that that code can now be removed. Would be great. Deleting code is always good. The behavior of isObject has changed for objects of the very special class PHP incomplete class. So, can you get an object of that very special class, PHP incomplete class? That happens when you unserialize, using unserialize, either directly or indirectly when you're using the session extension. When you try to unserialize a variable that contains an object of a class that is not loaded and cannot be loaded through autoloading, then PHP gives you an object of type PHP incomplete class. For all intents and purposes, that is sort of an object, but it doesn't really work because it's incomplete. The class is not there, but it's an object. You can access the attributes of that object that were written in there, written into it by the unserialized function or the session extension. You can access them using the arrow notation. So according to syntax, it's an object. It doesn't have any methods because no class, but isObject returned false in PHP 7.1, and now it returns true. I'm not really sure which of the two is correct. I can only tell you that this change has happened. I think the problem is even before that unserialized should not try to give you something that it cannot create because the class doesn't exist. Maybe that problem should be or should have been addressed. But I can only tell you that this is how it happens right now. And I hope that you have no code that depends on isObject being used on PHP incomplete class and so on. I also hope, and now we're getting into the territory of changes where I looked at the change and I thought, why the hell is that even possible to begin with? And why are people using that? So, you can cast an array to an object. And you have been able to do that for a really long time. I really hope that nobody does that because it doesn't make any sense, at least not to me. At some point, somebody ran into a problem with that. If you have an array, and that array has integer keys, and you cast that array with integer keys to an object, you get an object that has attributes where the names of the attributes are integers. That works. What doesn't work is accessing those attributes because that's invalid syntax. Yeah? You cannot write $O arrow 1 to access that attribute or 0. You cannot. It's a syntax error. Yet PHP happily creates such an object using that weird operation, and there's not really another way of creating an object, an attribute like that, other than using variables, which hopefully nobody uses anyway, either. So the solution for that in PHP 7.2 is to convert these integer keys to strings, and then there are strings, and then you can access them. But please don't. It's not good for your sanity. A couple of things were removed and deprecated. They were sent to the desert. Actually, as we say in PHP, we sent them to Siberia, which is an old nickname for Peckle, but we only use that for extensions. So I used the picture of a desert. So removals and deprecations. It's a minor release, so we shouldn't be removing anything. But we had to remove something, which is xencrypt, because that's a security risk. The library that the mcrypt extension wraps has not been maintained and updated and fixed in years. Deprecating that extension did not help raise awareness for that issue. So it was removed. Now the code really breaks if you try to use mcrypt functionality with PHP 7.2. If you have code that uses mcrypt, and you use mcrypt for doing cryptography and security-related things, and if you use mcrypt, you are vulnerable to attacks in the underlying library. The cryptography is broken, or can be broken, depending on how you use it. So that's why we removed it. The only other things we removed, at least for one of which we are pretty sure that doesn't affect too many people. First of all, in the, 20 plus years that PHP has been supported on NetWare, we didn't really have that much interaction with people who used it on NetWare. And NetWare is no longer supported for quite some time, and that's why we removed the code as part of cleanup. And also, there's not really a point in supporting versions of Windows that Microsoft doesn't support anymore. So we removed Windows-specific code for Windows, for stuff older than Windows 7 and Server 2008. In PHP 7.2, we deprecated a couple of more features that will be removed in a future release, probably in PHP 8. And this is these are the highlights, if you will, of the things that were deprecated. Those are all the deprecations on the language level in the core of PHP. There are a couple of deprecations and extensions like mbstring and Postgres, I think. I don't know. Those are the language level deprecations. And the first time I read the term bare word unquoted strings, I had no idea what that was. After I realized what it was, I realized, okay, of course, I've known this feature, or wouldn't really go as far as calling it a feature, but maybe 20 years ago it was an interesting idea, but or sounded like a nice idea, but we shouldn't have done it. I just didn't know that there was a term for it. So what does that mean? If you use a constant that is not declared, PHP falls back to declaring a new constant on the fly that has the name of the constant as its value. Please don't do that. And in PHP 7.1, that is just a notice. Use of undefined constant foo, assumed foo, blah, blah, blah. As of PHP 7.2, that was elevated or escalated from a notice to a warning, with the notice that it's going to be removed in a future version of P, likely PHP 8. The original mechanism for autoloading has been deprecated. Back when PHP 5.0 came out, the only way to have an autoloading mechanism was to have a global function that was named __ autoload. That was very limited because you could only have one autoloader, and it was really hard to chain autoloaders. For instance, you wanted to use a library or a framework that came with its own autoloader. Now you had to modify your autoloader to chain and delegate to third-party autoloaders, what was really inconvenient to work with. And in PHP 7.1, if I remember correctly, Marcus added SPL autoload register, which allowed you to register more than one autoloader. And it did not have to be a special name anymore. You could use anonymous functions later when PHP 5.3 came out. And that's basically how we do autoloading today. Mostly you don't care about that anyway, because the autoloader code is generated using a tool like PHP Autoload Builder or Composer or what have you. But the old mechanism is still there. And that can lead to confusing situations when you use an old code base that used this mechanism with a version of PHP, with a newer version of PHP and versions of components that have their own autoloader. Then you can run into weird situations. So it's time to get rid of that. And that's what we started now with PHP 7.2. It's deprecated. At least as far as I can see, it's not a deprecation that gives you a deprecation notice at runtime. It's deprecated in documentation and in the changelog of PHP 7.2. So it has no immediate effect, but you should take this into account once PHP 8 comes around. That will no longer work. This should have been deprecated back when PHP 5.3 came out in 2009. PHP 5.3 introduced anonymous functions and closures, which were possible, sort of possible, really inconvenient and slow and crappy. But to some degree, it was possible before PHP 5.3 using the arcane, bizarre, ancient create function, which among many other flaws only works on strings. So you give it strings, and that's just string, and you cannot really syntax check that during development. The IDE cannot really look inside there. The bytecode cannot be optimized for that because it cannot really be compiled. It's a runtime eval thing, and if you have an error in there, you only see that at runtime and not at compile time. You don't want to use that. And if you need anonymous functions, since PHP 5.3, you can have them natively. You don't need that clutch to get it working. So hopefully nobody uses it anymore. This is the backwards compatibility change. Like, I looked at this, said, yes, great that this is gone, or that this will be gone in the foreseeable future. And I was 100% sure that I would not be affected by this personally. 24 hours later, Travis CI had a new nightly build of PHP 7.2, and the tests for PHP unit were failing. Like half of them. And I woke up in the morning and looked at that and said, I didn't do anything yesterday. Why did it work yesterday? Why is it not working today? And I looked at the output and I realized, oh, hang on. That was the thing that you were happy about yesterday, and now it comes back to bite you. Unfortunately, dealing with each is not as easy, is not always as easy as replacing it with for each, as I had in the example before. This is from a part of PHP unit that is probably among the oldest code that is still in PHP unit, that was written like, I don't know, 15 years ago, 16 years ago. It wasn't even written by me. It was written by Andre, but who cares? It's in my project. I'm responsible for that, so it had to be fixed. And unfortunately, in that case, it was not as easy as replacing each with for each, because that code does some really weird modifications into nested each things that modify the thing over which each runs. And after a couple of hours of trying to rewrite that code without using each, with for each instead of each, I just replaced it like this. I still use current because for some reason current has not been deprecated, only each. Of course, this was the very short-term fix. That's the one I did before. So the first thing was I suppressed that thing. Of course, then PHP Code Sniffer started complaining, hey, you're suppressing something there. And the IDE complained, hey, you're doing something that violates your coding guidelines. Yes, I know. But I don't want Travis to yell at me while other pull requests are coming in. So it took a little bit of time, and eventually someone sent me a pull request that did this, and it fixed things, and it still uses current and next and reset and so on, and hopefully, so my goal is to completely get rid of that class at some point very soon. Then I don't need to fix it. But I probably in 9 out of 10 cases, you have something like this. Like this is how, if I have seen each be used in the wild, that's usually how I've seen it. That's the old PHP 3 syntax before PHP 4 added for each to iterate over arrays, which was then later expanded to also cover objects that implement the iterator interface. You used while list key, comma val equals each, and then you could iterate over that. If you've never seen PHP 3 code, good for you. Bonus points if you have never written code like that. When this was deprecated, I had another what the hell moment, because I didn't know that this was possible. The unset cast has been removed. I have no idea why you would want to use that syntax to unset X. Now that raises a deprecation notice. It's really bizarre, and I have seen it never used in the wild. Or I have, and I forgot about it. There are also new features. Not just breaking things, but also new things, new shiny things. But not a lot of them. Like of course, I'm only focusing on the language level. Various extensions have new functions and new functionality and so on. On the language level, the biggest change is the introduction of the object type. You can now use the object keyword in type declarations, which also means that you could no longer can have a class named object. It was if I remember correctly, it was not reserved in code, it was reserved in documentation. Like, don't blame us if at some point in the future we decide to make object a reserved word. You have been warned. So this allows you to say in the signature of a functional method, I want an object, any object. I don't really care if that implements a specific interface or is of a specific type. I just want an object. And that is not really something that you want to use in application-specific code. It's something that makes sense in a couple of cases when you write generic libraries. For instance, like a component that does something on objects, on object graphs, on object structures, and wants to ensure in code that what you pass to it as an argument really is an object without having to manually use isObject inside the body of the method. So if you call such a function or method that says, I want an object with something that is not an object, you get a type error, which is what you would expect, I guess. When it comes to inheritance, we need to take covariance and contravariance into account, which just means that if you have a parent class that has a method that wants a specific foo, a child class can extend that and make that type replace that specific type with the generic object type. And that's allowed because it still works with a foo, but it also works with other things. And the same, just in reverse order, when you think about it, the covariance for the return type declarations. You have a parent class that says I return something of type object. A child class can get more specific with the return type. Again, the thing that it returns is also an object, so the contract of the parent class still holds. You're not allowed to do that the other way around. You have a parent class that says, I want an object, any object, just give me an object. And then you have a child class that says, I only work with a specific object. That reduces the argument range. That's not allowed. And then you get a warning. Not sure I agree with the fact that it's just a warning, it should be an error, but sometimes PHP is very lenient and only tries to nudge you in the right direction with a warning. It is now possible to remove argument type annotations when overriding an inherited method. Following the same logic that we had with the object type. So for instance, if we have a parent class that says in a method, I want an integer, then a child class that overrides this can say, I work with any type. And that's okay, because it still also works with an int. And prior to PHP 7.2, that was a fatal error. Aside from the language itself, where we now have the object type and the parameter type widening that I just showed, probably the biggest change or the biggest new functionality that we got is related to cryptography and security. The password hashing API, the password underscore functions, they now support the Argon 2i hashing algorithm, which recently won a hashing algorithm competition. So that makes it very good, I guess. I don't know. I'm not really into cryptography and security. That would be something that Arne could talk about for at least an hour or so. Sorry, I'm not Arne. And the other major thing that happened, what PHP had been lacking for quite a while, was a dedicated extension that deals with cryptography functionality. Talked about earlier, mcrypt no longer maintained. Even the library that it uses, libmcrypt, has been unmaintained for quite a while. But in the open source universe, over the last couple of years, libsodium established itself as the go-to library for cryptography stuff, with convenient APIs and good implementations, and of the various algorithms. And we now have an extension that wraps this library, which provides a modern, easy-to-use API for encryption, decryption, signatures, password hashing, and more. So if you need to do something like that, if you need to migrate code away from mcrypt, this should be your target. Some of the stuff that libsodium can do, you can do with OpenSSL and PHP's OpenSSL extension. Yes. Not really a feature, but performance is again an issue in a very positive way. Where PHP 7.1 didn't really get much faster than PHP 7.0, PHP 7.2 got faster. And I have good news for you in case you are interested in reading academic papers that explain why PHP 7.2 is faster and why PHP 7.3 has the potential to be even faster than PHP 7.2. The people responsible for PHP 7 being a lot faster than PHP 5. Remember the benchmarks from the beginning, 2 to 3 times faster. Those performance improvements are mostly, almost exclusively due to the work done by Nikita Popov, Dmitry Stogov, and Xintian. And Dmitry and Nikita have started to go to academic conferences on compiler design and language runtimes and share with the academic community the types of optimizations and implementation techniques they have applied in PHP 7.0. What they did in PHP 7.1 was, or for PHP 7.1 was lay the groundwork for an optimization framework of PHP bytecode, but not that many optimizations were implemented there. In PHP 7.2, we have the first optimizations that work on bytecode that use this new framework, and they are not stopping. They keep optimizing things, and the latest optimization that they do, they come next year with PHP 7.3 because it's too late to get that into PHP 7.2 and stabilize it. Quite an interesting paper if you like computer science papers. Yeah, this is a benchmark that I did, I think, last week or so, with last week's nightly build of PHP 7.2. And I came to about 8% faster with the PHP unit test suite that had 44,000 unit tests, no I/O. You can get, and that was without the optimizations enabled. That's just other stuff that you get always without turning on the bytecode cache, opcache, and turning on the optimizer. For some reason, I was unable to turn on the optimizations on the command line, which is where PHP unit runs. This is something I plan on figuring out with the help of Dmitry at some point. Okay. We've talked about stuff that has the potential of breaking things. Hopefully it does not break anything for you because you never wrote weird, confusing code like that. Do yourself a favor and write boring code. Write code that doesn't use really bizarre syntax constructs. We talked about new features, and I told you that PHP 7.2 is faster. If you need more arguments for going from PHP 5 to PHP 7, the time for those arguments is now, because time for PHP 5 is running out. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, which I think is good news because life is too short for old software, but that's only when I'm wearing my open source hat. And okay, so PHP 5 was great, but it's time to move on. And a lot of big, popular, major PHP-based open source projects have started to move on. Latest version of Neos, which came out in January, requires PHP 7. PHP Unit 6, which came out in February, requires PHP 7. Latest version of Typo 3 requires PHP 7. PHP Spec requires PHP 7. Laravel requires PHP 7. Symfony 4, which is scheduled for release in next month, requires PHP 7.1. They skip PHP 7.0, and there's a reason for that that I'll show you in just a bit. PHP Unit 7 is planned for next February. It will require PHP 7.1. PHP Unit 8, planned for 2019, will require PHP 7.2, and so on. You get the idea. The world moves on. The PHP community has learned from a big mistake from the PHP 4 to PHP 5 migration. When PHP 5 was released, we did not announce an end-of-life date for PHP 4. It took us 3 years to say, okay, a year from now, we drop support for PHP 4. That no longer happens. We learned from that. PHP has a steady release cycle with a new minor version every year, with clear rules on how long that's going to be supported, so you can plan for that. And other projects from the PHP ecosystem now piggyback on that support lifecycle and say things like what PHP Unit does. PHP Unit says every year in February there's a new major version that drops support for versions of PHP that are no longer supported by the PHP project. So this is the timeline of PHP 5. Was originally released in July 2004. Some people say PHP 5.0 was an alpha release. PHP 5.1 was a beta. PHP 5.2 was the first stable release, but it was missing namespaces, which is why PHP 5.3 became so popular. And then the PHP project got sidetracked with PHP 6. The thing that never was and never will be, even if certain book publishers try to tell you something else. One of the best-selling PHP books is still PHP 6 and MySQL 6. There is no PHP 6, there is no MySQL 6, but that book is still selling. But ever since PHP 5.5, we are on the steady release cycle, and that works, and it's reliable. There's a website or a page on php.net where you can look up what the currently supported versions of PHP are. If the version of PHP you're using is not here, or if it is red, then you are using a version of PHP that is dead. Sorry. If it's orange, then it is in security support, which means it gets critical security issues fixed, but no bug fixes. If it's green, that means it is actively supported, bugs are regularly fixed, security issues are fixed. So if you still use PHP 5.5 or older, then you use a version of PHP that already reached its end of life. If you still use PHP 5.6, then you use a version of PHP that will reach its end of life on December 31st, 2018. That is the end of next year. You have 1 more year to get away from PHP 5 before it's no longer supported. If you use PHP 7.0, then you use a version of PHP that will reach its end of active support this December. Because this December, PHP 7 has been out for 2 years. Each new release of PHP gets 2 years of active support, 2 years of bug fixes, and then 1 additional year of critical security fixes. Yeah, if you need to see this different with some bold and some font magic, here you go. If you need to see it different with less words, there you go. Sorry about the repetition, but this is important. You want to be on a version of PHP that is actively supported by the PHP project. Yes, you can pay operating system vendors or other companies a lot of money to get support for PHP 5.6 for the next 10 years. But that doesn't really make you happy. At least it shouldn't. That's all that I know right now about PHP 7.2 that I think you should know. We have a couple of minutes left for questions, if there are any. Too early for questions? Everybody needs coffee or fresh air? Or
there is one small thing.
yes.
You actually said when you were showing your code that you would like to get rid of curating next.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Since it's the standard stuff for iterators.
Mm-hmm. So the question was, why do I want to get rid of the built-in functions current and next when the same naming holds true for iterators? Yeah, you're probably correct. Maybe I do not want to get rid of that. It's just that conceptually, on the internal side of things of PHP, current and next are closely related to each. And maybe it's just because I already worked with those functions back in PHP 3 when we didn't have for each, and I'm so used to using them together. So to me, it's conceptually the same thing. And when one is deprecated, then you don't really need the others anymore. Maybe that feeling is wrong. I don't know. There's probably a reason why they were not deprecated. Yes. Other questions? Okay, then enjoy your coffee break. Thank you.